Chapter 6 is called Let's Kill Two. Mrs. McDonald checked out of the motel while her husband loaded up the RV and consulted his road atlas. Everybody piled in, and Dr. McDonald pulled onto I 294 south. Des Plaines is only about half an hour from downtown Chicago. The kids amused themselves in the back while Mrs. McDonald fired up the GPS. Then she reclined her seat a few inches and began to leaf through an Illinois guidebook. Look, Ben, Mrs. McDonald said. The grave of Robert Earl Hughes is in Illinois. Who was he? Pep asked, not quite sure. She wanted to know the answer. Robert Earl Hughes was the world's heaviest man, her mother explained. He weighed over 1,000 pounds. Poor guy. He was only 32 when he died. They say he was buried in a grand piano. Unfortunately, the gravesite of this amazing man was in Benville, over 4 hours away. It was tempting to go there, but in life, you have to set your priorities. 4 hours would be a long drive to see a gravestone, even if it was the gravestone of somebody who was buried in a piano. Equally tempting, at least for Mrs. McDonald, would have been a trip to see the world's largest statue of Abraham Lincoln in Ashmore, Illinois. And then, of course, there was the Grain Elevator Museum in Atlanta, Illinois. But that was 154 miles away and in the wrong direction. Nobody had the enthusiasm to drive so far. It's a shame we're going to miss those grain elevators, Mom Coke said, sharing a silent giggle with his sister. They sound really cool. None of the McDonald's was conscious of it, but there was one thing they all wanted to see: a city. Ever since they'd left California a week earlier, they had been driving past deserts, prairies, billboards, cornfields, dairy farms, and lots of small towns. They missed the excitement of a city. Soon the suburbs gave way to office parks. The office parks gave way to the enormous O'Hare Airport. And from Route 90 east, the majestic skyline of Chicago came into view. The Windy City, Coke proclaimed. The city of the big shoulders, said Dr. McDonald. That's how Carl Sandburg described it. Didn't he play for the Cubs? Asked Coke. That was Ryan Sandberg, Dr. McDonald corrected him. Carl Sandburg was a poet. Ha! Pep proclaimed to her brother. You don't know everything. Okay, here's today's agenda, Mrs. McDonald announced from the front seat. First, the International Museum of Surgical Science. They have antique instruments that doctors use to drill holes in skulls, and they also have some skulls with holes drilled into them. And get this, they've got a copy of the death mask of Napolitan. It will be a perfect for Amazing But True. That place sounds gross, Mom Pep commented, despite her fascination with morbid things. It was Pep, after all, who'd convinced the family to visit the Donner Party exhibit back in Nevada, which was all about cannibals. Second, the Museum of Science and Industry. Mrs. McDonald continued, they have an exhibit called Body Slices. It says here that they have male and female cadavers, each cut into half-inch slices and preserved between sheets of glass. Ugh, said Pep, despite her obvious fascination. That is disgusting, Mom. We don't want to look at that stuff. Well, the good news is you don't have to, Mrs. McDonald said cheerfully. I'm going to look at that stuff. Where are the rest of us going? Asked Pep. Dr. McDonald leaned over, pulled 3 tickets out of the glove compartment, and waved them in the air. Wrigley Field, baby, he yelled. We're going to see the Cubs play, asked Coke excitedly. All right. Dr. McDonald dropped his wife off at the Loop in downtown Chicago and proceeded up North Lake Shore Drive until he found a parking lot that would admit recreational vehicles and wasn't too far from the ballpark. They got out and walked the rest of the way to the corner of North Clark Street and West Addison. This is historical ground, Dr. McDonald said, throwing an arm around each of his children. It's one of the oldest Major League Baseball parks still standing. Babe Ruth hit his famous called shot home run here back in 1932, you know. Can we get cotton candy? Asked Pep, no big fan of baseball. Sure, her dad replied. As far as I'm concerned, it's still your birthday today. The game had already started, so they rushed inside to find their seats on the third base side. Dr. McDonald bought cotton candy for both twins and pointed out the distinctive ivy-colored outfield walls. Wrigley Field felt like a sanctuary to Coke and Pep. Here, for a change, they could forget their troubles: lunatics in bowler hats, evil health teachers, maniacal teenagers who resembled comic book characters for a few hours at least. The ballpark was packed. The visiting team was the St. Louis Cardinals, longtime rivals of the Cubs. The crowd went wild when the Cubs scored a couple of runs in the second inning. When the Cards tied it up in the third, boos rained down on the field. When the inning was over, Dr. McDonald told the kids to look at the video screen below the scoreboard. This message was flashing. Happy 13th birthday yesterday to Coke and Pep McDonald. Then, next to those words, the fan cam box appeared, and there was a video image of Coke and Pep. When they saw themselves on the screen, they smiled and waved. Everybody cheered. How did they know it was our birthday? Pep said excitedly. I called ahead, Dr. McDonald said. Isn't that expensive, Dad? Coke asked. Don't worry about it, Dr. McDonald replied. One of my old college buddies works for the Cubs. The message flashed several more times, and then the screen faded to black. A few seconds later, it was replaced by a strange message. Everyone stared at the video screen confused. Huh? Said Dr. McDonald. I wonder what that means. Hey, check it out! Somebody a few rows behind them hollered. The guy running the video screen must have had too many beers. Coke squinted at the message and looked over at his sister quizzically. It looks like a cipher, Pep whispered in his ear so their father would not hear. What does it mean? Coke whispered back. How should I know? Well, you're the queen of ciphers, Coke whispered. You're supposed to be good at this stuff. This stuff takes time, Pep told him. The message disappeared from the screen and was replaced by an ad for a Chicago pizza parlor. Luckily, Coke had gazed at it long enough to burn the symbols into his memory. Someone knows we're here, Pep whispered nervously to her brother. We need to go. Dad, can we leave? Coke asked. Leave, he replied. It's only the top of the fourth inning. Let's stay at least until the seventh inning stretch. Okay, the twins grumbled. For the next two innings, Coke and Pep had little interest in watching the ball game. They were too busy scanning the crowd, looking out for guys with bowler hats, evil health teachers, Archie clones, or perhaps even Dr. Warsaw. Their names and faces had been up on the video screen. There was no telling who might be watching them through binoculars from some distant point in the ballpark, or what that person might be planning. They were strangely quiet while eating hot dogs their father brought them from a vendor. The Cardinals scored 3 runs in the fifth, and the mood of the crowd was turning sour. There's nothing more dangerous than an angry Cubs fan. You would think that after 100 years without winning the World Series, they would get used to losing ball games, but they never do. It was 6-2 at the end of the sixth inning. When a female usher came over to their row and tapped Coke and Pep on the shoulders, they both jumped. Would you two please come with me? The usher said sweetly. We have something special for you. Pep looked at her father, terrified. Surely he would protect them. Go ahead, Dr. McDonald said, a big smile on his face. This is part of your birthday present, too. Have fun. The twins got up and followed the usher up the steps and through a doorway. There was a tunnel there that led to the press box. What's this all about? Coke asked. Nobody told you, said the usher. You're in for a treat. Your dad must know somebody pretty important. They don't just let anybody leave the crowd and take me out to the ball game during the seventh inning stretch. Oh, the twins said. The usher led them to the private booth on the press level and opened the door with a key. Sing loud, she said before leaving. A woman was sitting in the booth looking out at the field. There was a microphone on the shelf in front of her and a bottle of Purell. When the door opened, she swiveled around in her chair. Mrs. Higgins! Pep screamed, shrinking back in horror. Coke quickly grabbed for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. They were locked in the little booth, and their evil health teacher was sitting no more than 3 feet away from them. They had no weapons and not even a frisbee or a deck of cards to defend themselves. Mrs. Higgins was wearing a Cubs shirt and had a big smile on her face. Well, if it isn't Coke and Pep, the McDonald twins, she said pleasantly. Fancy meeting you here. There was a 4-inch horizontal scar that went across the front of her neck, and she touched it involuntarily. You leave us alone, Coke said, getting into a defensive stance and pointing his finger at her. He was ready for anything. You remember what happened the last time you messed with us. Calm down, Coke, Mrs. Higgins said, laughing. I've retired from the paid assassination business. Retired? Pep asked. Are you putting us on? I got sick of it, Mrs. Higgins said. All of it. Chasing kids all over the country, setting schools on fire, luring unsuspecting victims into diabolical traps. It's exhausting. And do you think Dr. Warsaw ever paid me a dime in overtime or paid for my health insurance? Forget about it. I was glad you two got rid of him. It gave me the motivation I needed to start a new career. Try something different. Do you mean it? Pep asked. Not quite sure if Mrs. Higgins could be trusted. Sure, Mrs. Higgins said. That's why I applied for this job working in the public relations department. It gives me a chance to use my people skills. People skills, Coke said. You tried to kill us. As Mrs. Higgins laughed heartily, the twins noticed the name tag on her shirt. Audrey Higgins, Public Relations Department, Chicago Cubs. You and I may have had our petty disagreement, she said, but it's all water under the bridge. That's my philosophy. I'm willing to let bygones be bygones, and problems we had with each other in the past are history as far as I'm concerned. It was just yesterday, Coke said. Come on, Mrs. Higgins said, reaching into a drawer in front of her. Lighten up. We have these free Cubs t-shirts for the people who sing Take Me Out to the Ball Game. She handed Coke and Pep the shirts. They looked at each other for a moment to see what the other was going to do. Go ahead, put them on, said Mrs. Higgins. It's about time to sing. As the twins put the t-shirts over their shirts, the Cardinals made the third out in the top of the seventh inning. That's when Mrs. Higgins suddenly pulled out a gun and pointed it at Coke and Pep. The smile was gone from her face. She looked like a different person. Now it's time for you to die. What? Cook exclaimed, sticking his hands in the air. You little punks killed my fiance, she barked. You and Dr. Warsaw were going to be married, Pep sputtered. We didn't know. He was the only man I ever loved, Mrs. Higgins said, her eyes watery. And you killed him. It was self-defense, Coke explained. He was trying to kill us. I've got news for you, little twerps, Mrs. Higgins said, leaning in close and sticking the gun in Coke's face. I put a bomb under the bench in the Cubs' dugout. It's programmed to go off when you sing the phrase 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out. What? Are you crazy? Please rise, the public address announcer said. Today, Coke and Pep McDonald of Point Reyes Station, California, will lead us in the traditional singing of Take Me Out to the Ball Game. An organ played the familiar introduction to the song. Coke and Pep looked at each other. Mrs. Higgins pushed the microphone closer to them with one hand and the gun closer to them with the other. Sing, she ordered. Take me out to the ball game. The twins croaked out the first line. The crowd began to boo. Pep had her eyes closed in terror. She could barely speak, much less sing another line. I said sing, Mrs. Higgins ordered. Take me out to the crowd. Keep singing or I'll blow your heads off, Mrs. Higgins sneered, brandishing the pistol. Buy me some peanuts and cracker jacks. Those kids stink! Somebody shouted. Sing! Mrs. Higgins ordered. Tears were rolling down Pep's cheeks. I don't care if I never get back. Those kids sing worse than Ozzy Osbourne, someone yelled. Sing! Mrs. Higgins said, sticking the gun into Coke's ribs. Root, root, root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame. Now finish it, Mrs. Higgins ordered. It's the Cubs or you. For it's 1, 2. At that point, Coke grabbed the microphone. There's a bomb in the Cubs dugout, he shouted quickly. Under the bench. Get out. Evacuate the dugout. Evacuate the stadium. This is not a joke. There's a bomb. Down on the field, the Cubs players came running out of their dugout. In the stands, people got out of their seats and rushed for the exit. Quickly, it became bedlam at Wrigley Field. Hot dog vendors were getting knocked over. Little kids and old ladies were getting trampled. In the booth, Mrs. Higgins threw back her head and laughed. Then she took a bite out of her gun. It was fake? Coke yelled. You mean to tell me there's no bomb in the dugout? I am such a chocolate holic, said Mrs. Higgins as she took another bite out of the gun. Down on the field, a bomb squad in full protective gear was tearing apart the Cubs' dugout, throwing bats, gloves, and seat cushions every which way. The game had been officially called on account of a bomb scare. The Cardinals had won. The Cub fans, who were already angry, were now furious as they streamed out the exits. Why did you do that? Pep asked. Mrs. Higgins glared at her with a look that sent shivers down Pep's spine. Herman Warsaw was the kindest, gentlest, most loving man I ever met, she spat. We were going to spend the rest of our lives together. So now I'm going to make the rest of your lives a living hell until the day you die. And you can count on that being very soon. Let's see if you can make it out of this ballpark in one piece. She opened the door with a key and the twins ran out of the booth. They located the first exit sign and headed down the ramp, along with hundreds of Chicago's beloved bleacher bums. Hey, somebody shouted, it's them, the kids who made the bomb scare. We forfeited the game because of them. Let's get those kids. Yeah! Pep turned around. What do we do? She asked her brother. We get out of here, Coke replied. The twins dashed down the ramp, passing through the disgruntled fans, heading for the parking lot. Kill them! Somebody shouted. Kill those kids! These people are angry, way out of proportion to what happened, Pep said as Coke grabbed her hand and started running full speed. It's just a game, not to them. Hundreds of people were chasing them out Gate K, some of them waving foam fingers and miniature wooden baseball bats. Run! Coke yelled, sprinting down the west uh, Waveland Avenue. These people are crazy. We have to find Dad, Pep yelled back. Coke's cell phone rang. It was his father calling. He didn't pick up. Later, Coke told his sister, let's get out of this neighborhood first. The twins ran for their lives 2 blocks down Waveland and then made a right on North Clark Street and a left on West Gray Street. By that time, the angry mob had been chasing them had fallen back. The twins ducked into an alley and stopped, panting and gasping for breath. It was only then that they noticed what it said on the back of the t-shirts Mrs. Higgins had given them. The Cubs suck.